The valuation of functions as distinct from content has its place. Here, function is universal in relation to the purpose that it serves. Religious sentiment is a universal, by contrast, with the content of a particular creed. Cognition is universal as against any one of its particular objects. Power is universal by contrast with the specific and varied problems to which it is always applied in the same way. All of these are forms and frameworks which comprehend a great variety of material. Money seems to participate in this trend when valuation becomes independent of the material of money and is transferred to its function, which is universal and yet not abstract. The valuation, which at first concerned a particular functioning substance, becomes differentiated, and while the precious metal continues to be valued, its function, which goes beyond the particular substance with which it is associated, attains a specific value of its own. The form in which money exists for us is that of mediating exchanges and measuring values. A metal becomes money by assuming this form, just as ideas about the supernatural become religion when they are incorporated into the function of religious sentiment, and as the block of marble becomes a work of art when artistic creativity endows it with a form that is simply the expression in space of the artistic function. The refinement of the sense of the original dissolves the interfusion of function and allows each to develop as an independent value. It is true that the functional value of money still needs to be represented. The decisive point, however, is that its value no longer arises from what represents it. On the contrary, the latter is quite secondary, and its nature has no importance except on technical grounds which have nothing to do with the sense of value. Chapter 3. Money and the Sequence of Purposes. Action towards an end as the conscious interaction. Between subject and object, the great antinomy in the history of thought, whether the contents of reality are to be conceived and interpreted in terms of their causes or their consequences, i.e. the opposition between a causal and a teleological approach, finds its original expression in a distinction within our practical motivations. The feeling that we call instinct appears to be tied to a physiological process in which stored up energies strive for release. The instinctual drive terminates when these energies find expression in action. If it is simply an instinct, then it is satisfied as soon as it has dissolved into action. In contrast with this direct causal process, which is reflected in consciousness as a primitive instinctual feeling, are those actions that arise, so far as our consciousness is concerned, from a representation of the ends that they will achieve. In this case, we experience ourselves as being drawn rather than driven. The feeling of satisfaction, therefore, does not arise from the action alone, but from the consequences that the action produces. If, for instance, an aimless inner unrest drives us to furious activity, then this belongs to the category of instinctual behavior. If we undertake the same activity in order to attain some precise kind of well-being, then it belongs to the category of purposive behavior. Eating exclusively to satisfy hunger falls within the first category, eating to enjoy the flavor of the dishes falls within the second. Sexual intercourse as an animal instinct belongs to the first category, but as an activity directed to the attainment of a particular kind of pleasure it belongs to the second. This distinction seems to me vital in two respects. To the extent that our actions are purely instinctual, that is causally determined in the strict sense, there is a fundamental incongruity between the psychological state, which is the cause of action, and the ensuing consequences. The state that moves us to action has no more significant qualitative relation to the action and its result than has the wind to the falling of the fruit that it blows from the trees. On the other hand, when the conception of an end is experienced as a motive, cause and effect are congruous in their conceptual and perceptible content. Nevertheless, in this case too, the cause of action is, even though this cannot be defined in a strictly scientific way, the real force of the conception or of its physical correlate, and this force or energy must be rigorously distinguished from the intellectual content of the conception. The content itself, as an ideal representation of action and events, has absolutely no force. It possesses only conceptual validity and can become real only to the extent that it is endowed with real energy, in the same way as justice and morality, as ideas, have no historical influence until they are adopted as determinants of action by real powers. The controversy over the relevance of causality, or teleology, to human action may thus be decided in the following way. Since the consequences of action exist in a psychologically effective form before they acquire an objective existence, a strict causal relation can be upheld. Only those intellectual conceptions that have become psychological forces need be taken into account, and thus cause and effect are entirely distinct, whereas the identity between the intellectual content of motive and consequences has absolutely nothing to do with the actual production of events. Another difference between instinctual drives and purposive striving is still more significant for the present problem. To the extent that our action is simply causally determined, in the strict sense, the whole process comes to an end when the turbulent forces are discharged in activity, and the feelings of tension and constraint disappear as soon as the instinct culminates in action. The instinct consumes itself by its natural continuation in action, and the whole process remains confined within the individual. The process that is guided by a conscious purpose is entirely different. It is directed to a definite objective result of action, and it attains its final end through the reaction of this result upon the subject or of the subject upon the result. The fundamental significance of purposive action is the interaction between subject and object. Our mere existence involves us in this interaction, and purposive action is therefore rooted in the nature of the mind. Our relationship to the world may be represented as an arc that passes from the subject to the object, incorporates the object and returns to the subject. It is true that every fortuitous and mechanical contact with things displays the same external character, but as purposive action it is suffused and held together by the unity of our consciousness. As natural beings, we are in constant interaction with the world of nature, and coordinated with it. It is only in purposive action that the self as personality differentiates itself from the natural elements within and outside itself. Or regarded from another aspect, it is only when a purposive agent is distinguished from the purely causal system of nature that the unity of the two can be re-established at a higher level. This theoretical relationship is to be found, with some modifications, in the difference that is supposed to exist between the labor of civilized and primitive peoples. The former is said to be regular and methodical, the latter irregular and spasmodic. In other words, the former involves deliberate overcoming of our resistance to work, while the latter is only a release of nervous energy. This does not mean that the real purpose of all purposive action is located in the acting subject, that the reason for attaining an objective always lies in the feelings that are retroactively aroused by the object. This may be the case in egoistic actions proper, but there are innumerable other actions in which the identity of motive and result is concerned only with the result in the sense of attaining the object, with the non-subjective happening.